to see everyone. My name is Lori Danielson. I have the pleasure of introducing Fred Nation, our speaker today. I am also on the Riverscape board and for the last year, and I'll tell you, it's just been such an eye-opening experience for me to see what that board is doing to help transform our river and what they've done over the last decade and a half. So it's really, really exciting to be here to introduce Fred to talk about one of our topics in our speaker series for waterways. And really, really interesting topics that we have. And today, Fred is going to highlight, with some assistance from some others, the pearls of the Wabash. And I don't know that Fred needs much introduction for this group, but just as background, he has been involved in Riverscapes for a decade and a half since the inception as a board member and as an officer. So he's done so much great work in this area around the river. Lifelong resident of Terre Haute, has worked for Governor Bayh, worked for the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, has been a small business owner, and now knows a lot more, I bet, than all of us do about the pearls on the Wabash, and he's going to share all that great knowledge. So we want this to be interactive, I believe, so I'm going to turn over to Fred, and we'll have an exciting hour together.
Thank you. There we go. Okay, thank you. Hey, thank you, Lori, so much, and it's a pleasure to be here. And I know last night, were any of you here last night for Alan Shabbat? Oh, and we had a great presentation, I heard. And Alan is an expert in his field, or in this field. I do not pretend to be an expert on mussels. Now, I think I know more than several people here, so I hope to add to the knowledge. But if you look at the speaker series, we have some others who will be speaking that will get much more into the scientific area and more about the ecology of our river and everything that, all the elements that comprise this habitat and why we're here to talk about this today. But before I talk about mussels, I want to talk a little bit about how the waterways exhibit came about. How many of you have been to the School Administration building? Several, but several have not. First of all, I've got a great hint for you, because most of you, no doubt, have not been to the new School Administration building, which is at the former West Vigo Elementary School. When you go west on National Avenue, past the stoplight where First National Bank is, keep going, and on your left, when you see the Subway sandwich shop, turn left and just go all the way down, and I will run right into the building. Now, you can explore southern West Terre Haute on many streets, but that's the best way to get there. And you'll be very, very impressed with the school. You'll be very, very impressed with what they've done with the administration building. It's a real credit to the community, and we hope a real help for West Terre Haute. Well, how did this all come about? You know, we are here at the Vigo County Public Library. It is one of the great resources of our community, and no doubt one of the best libraries in the state of Indiana, the Midwest. And they had something to do with this in more ways than just being the host for this today. This came about because Sarah Trover on the staff of the library noticed an email or other information about the Waterways exhibit being available. So she contacted Gene Santucci and myself from Riverscape, suggesting this isn't probably something the library can do, because, but maybe Riverscape would be interested in doing it. So we looked at it, and the first real challenge was, it's for small communities. Terre Haute's too big. So what do? So well, how about West Terre Haute? After all, Riverscape's focus has been on Wabashiki and the trail network and West Terre Haute and Dewey Point. Let's bring it to West Terre Haute. And then the question was, well, where in West Terre Haute? Library? Well, this is a nice space, but it's not big enough. We needed a couple of thousand square feet to do it. And that's how we got to the administration building. Talked to Rob Hayworth, the Vigo County School Superintendent, who was so kind. This was all in July of 2020. That's when this started. Well, And it's all worked out exactly as we had planned, more or less. A little hiccup here and there, but considering COVID, considering all the challenges, we have a great location. We've had great cooperation with the exhibit, and it is now in place. It will be here through December, and we expect it to attract quite a few people. This is a collaboration between the Smithsonian Institution and the Indiana Humanities and other state humanities organizations through the Museum on Main Street project. It's designed for small town museums, libraries, and cultural organizations to serve as a community meeting place to convene conversations about waterways impacts and understanding about water means culturally, socially, and spiritually to our community and to others. It was launched in 2016 and is ongoing for I'm not sure how many years longer, but it will continue for a bit. Well, where is it at? Well, in Indiana, it was currently on view according to the Smithsonian website. There's more than one component of it. They're traveling. Currently on view at the Mid-Florida Event Center in Port St. Lucie, Florida, the Bayou Tech Museum in New Iberia, Louisiana, the Brownsville Historical Society in Brownsville, Texas, and West Terre Haute, Indiana, the Riverscape Wabash River Development Beautification, Inc. So then it's going to be at the Louisiana Sports Hall of Fame, the University of Texas, et cetera, et cetera. So it's an exhibit that's worth seeing. Anything that the Smithsonian has done well, and everybody, any organization lusts after having one of these traveling exhibits. First time Terre Haute has had one in a number of years, to my knowledge. The other sites in Indiana where it has gone to are North Webster, LaPorte County, Rolling Prairie, New Harmony, and it'll be in Madison and Centerville. So what is different about West Terre Haute is that it is close to a fairly good-sized city like Terre Haute, which gives us more resources than some of these locations have had. Some of us have been down to New Harmony to see the exhibit down there. They've got this great Richard Meyer designed building there on the banks of the Wabash. It's great to see, but they're 30 miles from Evansville and 30 miles from Vincennes. It's the University of Southern Indiana was the sponsor, but they don't have the kind of community resources to bring to bear like we do through the Vigo County Public Library, through Riverscape and its affiliates, through Indiana State University, St. Mary the Woods College, Rose Hallman, Ivy Tech, all of whom have pitched in, along with our local museums, the Vigo County Historical Society, the Children's Museum, and the Swope Museum currently has an exhibit by local artists of the River City Art Association based on the Wabash River and water, which I hope you all have a chance to stop by and see. You know, growing up in Terre Haute as I did, the Wabash River has always played an important part of my life. As I've thought about, I've always lived within a couple of miles of the Wabash River. And as a kid, spent a lot of time on the river banks, not on the river, but on the river banks, mostly in the area. If you took Maple Avenue and went straight west to the river, down through the river, what we call the river bottoms, which is farmland. And a bunch of us used to spend a lot of time there because there were these houses on stilts along the river. And there were a couple of guys that lived down there, which we, of course, were very fearful of, because who in the world would live down there by themselves? And they're a strange sort of people. And my particular recollection about this is when I was in college, I read that the guy who lived there had died. The last one that I knew about. And this is in the winter, and there was snow on the ground, and I walked down there, which is about, an interesting thing about the river and how it meanders. If you're at Riverfront Lofts there on Sycamore Street, the river's there. You go to Maple Avenue, which is about a mile north. The river is a mile west. Takes a great big runaround and then comes back up by the Elks Club further. So anyway, I walked back there on a winter's day, but I noticed there were some tracks in the snow. And when I got there, his building, the house had been burnt down. Someone had burned it down. But in the stuff that was laying around, there were a lot of books. So whoever this fellow was, he lived there and read and lived on the banks of the Wabash, and it was on stilts, so when the water came up, he was there. That wasn't unusual in those days. Right across from there, by the way, is the Oakley River Camp that you can get to from Barnhart Road. Barnhart Road is, if you come up over the 63 bridge, your first left, comes out in Marion Heights. Right before you get to Marion Heights, there's a road that goes back to the river. And there's an encampment of 20 or so river cabins there. I've been there. I suppose the Oakley refers to the Oakley family, Oakley grocery stores. It's been there at least since the early 20th century. So growing up on the river and watching it, I remember seeing people hunting for mussel shells out there. I'm not sure if I knew exactly what they were doing, because there were also a lot of fishermen on the Wabash then. There were also boaters, a lot more boaters on the Wabash, and there were water skiers on the Wabash, something you never see now. Why don't we see water skiers on the Wabash now? Anybody have an idea? That's it. You get killed by the Asian carp jumping. If you're going, I don't know how fast water skiers go, but I suppose it's 10, 15 miles an hour or so, and you hit a 25-pound fish jumping in the air, it would probably be quite an impact. So water skiing has disappeared from the Wabash. It's not because of water quality. The water quality in the Wabash is pretty good. I'm not an expert on that, but from what I've read, and of course it depends on the season, it depends on a whole lot of factors, but overall the water is now much cleaner than when I was growing up in the 1950s and 1960s there. The river, of course, is why we're here. It was here when the first inhabitants, the Native Americans who lived here, located along the river, and they used it as a source of food, fishing. They used mussels as a source of food. Also, they used the shells for various as implements and other uses. And then, of course, we had the European explorers, the fur traders come down through here. The missionaries came down through here. And then Terre Haute was founded on high ground, actually Fort Harrison, where the landing is now. And Terre Haute grew out of that. And we were here because of the river. And the river was used, again, by early settlers for fishing and food, ice in the winter. Increasingly, though, it became a place where factories located along, especially the industrial corridor, which was pretty much from where the Riverfront Lofts is now, which had a variety of industrial uses along there, all the way down to I-70. We had distilleries, and of course, we all remember the paper plant and the railroad tie plant, but there were distilleries and commercial solvents and the hominy mill and all kinds, and most of them discharged into the river. So the water quality suffered a lot through the years. And of course, Asian carp, as we already mentioned, have been introduced to the river. It's been another complication along with zebra mussels that's been a little bit of a problem too. But since the 1950s, beginning in the 1950s, there's been a real cleanup going on of the river because of the federal laws and state laws about sewage disposal. We started our quest in the 1950s to build a sewage disposal plant here. It took a while, and actually that whole process, even though we have an excellent sewage disposal plant, that whole process of upgrading is still going on. And over the next few years, there'll be a huge investment in a new sewer line that will eliminate most of the outflows into the river. I think there are about a dozen outflows. You can see them in Fairbanks Park. There's several in Fairbanks Park. And the way those work is we have mostly a combined sewer system in Terre Haute. And this is sanitary sewers. That's when we flush our toilets or use our drains, goes into that, but also storm sewers. So during a normal time, almost all of that, virtually all of that sewage is diverted into a sewer line that runs along First Street, runs along the river all the way down to the sewage disposal plant, and it's treated there and before it goes into the river. But when we have rains, there's not enough capacity, so those outflows along the river have flaps on them, and the water goes straight into the river, the sewage does. And you know, the old saying is that dilution is a solution to pollution. There's some truth to that, but we're mandated to remove those outflows, and that's what there's been some construction down going on around behind the old paper plant for a new lift station. They ran into some problems there, but eventually there'll be a new bigger sewer all along the river, and will eliminate, if not all of those outflows, virtually all of them, which will improve water quality. But water quality is still a problem from a lot of different sources. For example, along the river, there's still a lot of septic systems, but they're not only along the river, because the river is part of a whole system, and that system begins with little ditches along roads and gullies and everything that feeds into creeks, and the creeks feed into the river. So we don't always have the best controls in some of those areas. A lot of houses in rural areas still have septic tank systems. If they're maintained well, they work well, but they're not always maintained well. And then agricultural runoff is another a big issue, especially nitrates. And the nitrates flow into our river and go all the way down through the Mississippi, down in south of the Delta, south of New Orleans. And if you look at maps of this and aerial photos, you'll see this huge dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico where the nitrates, mostly nitrates, have come down from the Midwest into that. Now, Indiana is the largest contributor of nitrates of all the states in that. And that's because we have laxer rules and laws regarding agricultural runoff. That's being worked on very much by Purdue University and a lot of great farmers. The easiest solution to it is simply, when a farmer tills the land, have a strip of grass between the land and the ditch, and that'll filter a lot of that out. But some farmers still want to use every available inch of land, and that makes the problem worse. But that's beginning to become a minority of those kind of folks. Indiana, how is Indiana addressing this? Well, interestingly enough, Riverscape is a part of the solution to that. Indiana, under Governor Daniels, when facing some mounting pressure for us to adapt more stringent laws, instead, Governor Daniels decided to expand the wetlands reclamation program and provided quite a bit of tens of millions of dollars into that for organizations, counties, conservation organizations to acquire bottomland and the wetlands that have been drained, and to restore them to be their natural filtration points. And we are part of that, and now I think there's something like 20,000 acres or so that's been reclaimed, eventually be 35,000 acres from Sullivan County to Turkey Run. And that is making a tremendous difference. And that has been how Wabashiki has come about, because of a combination of laws, regulations, and funding. And that is all a good thing. And it's good for our river, and it's good for our mussel population too. Our water supply for Terre Haute came exclusively from the Wabash River through the Terre Haute Water Corporation, later Indiana American, until 1966. Then it was changed to 2/3 river water and 1/3 well water. That change was mostly because they were having trouble with some algae in the river, and we had still at that point a fairly good sized food processing industry here, including Quaker Maid and Page. There were a lot of problems with our water quality, and we have a lot of industry that is here because of the Wabash River and the aquifer that's underneath all this. Indiana as a whole is one of the few states that doesn't face a future water shortage, although that could happen and efforts are underway to manage it better. But we are blessed by that giant aquifer and its great supply of water. Well, mussels play an important part of this because of water quality, because they're filter feeders. They eat decaying organic material, microscopic plants and animals and bacteria. Very similar to oysters in the ocean or in the Gulf. They take in water. Well, what a mussel does is bury itself in the river bottom with vertically, and then they open up, and the water goes through them. They intake the water, and it goes through them, and they filter out the food elements and expel cleaner water. So that's where they are very, very important to us and very important to the health of the river. Now, mussels there are 75, roughly 75 varieties of mussels that are in the Wabash River basin. A lot of those in the Wabash itself, some only in tributaries, creeks, some in both. They've got some great names: wart face, monkey face, pig toe, pocketbook, banana, pistol grip, three ridges, heel splitter, washboard, bank creeper, ladyfinger. Those are examples of the different kinds of mussels that have been identified and discovered here. And the way that they have been used is that, well, let me back up here. The way they're fertilized is an interesting process. The fertilization occurs within the female, and they store eggs in the gills, the interior. And you think of an oyster, most of you are familiar with oysters. They have kind of gills inside. And the males release sperm in the open water, which the females filter into the gills. The fertilized eggs then are expelled, and they must attach to a host fish. So each of these names I just went through, each of them may have a different variety of fish that they attach to, that the eggs attach to as a kind of a parasitic relationship. And then they're carried about by the host fish. And after a few weeks of development, the eggs have developed to a standpoint where they drop off and drop down into the bottom of the river. Now, another factor why the Wabash was so great and is not as great now is because of our limestone bed through here. The early name of Wabashiki came about because that means white river, clear water, and at one time it was very clear because of the limestone bed here, especially in southern Indiana. But that has changed, and a lot of the problem has been caused by silting of the river, the more wash off from all these tributaries down there. So we don't have the same kind of bottom, clean bottom to the river, so mussels have a harder time anchoring themselves and living in that. Well, they're great for the ecosystem because they're natural filters. They're sources of food for many other fish, mammals and birds, if you're on the river now, you'll see in certain places, sandbars, you'll see piles of mussel shells. Well, where do they come from? Well, they come from otters and raccoons, who the otters pick them up and bring them up to the bank, and then they open them and eat them, leaving the shell there. And raccoons do the same thing. Raccoons eat a lot of mussel shells. They stabilize the river bottom. They improve oxygenation. And they're indicators of good water quality. And the empty shell provides habitat for fishes and other invertebrates. And they were food for Native Americans. Commercial shelling of mussels on the Wabash River started in the late 19th century, and it was done for buttons. Literally hundreds of button factories were located along the river. The shells were taken. It's always hard to open these, isn't it? You have that problem at home? Thank you. This is what a type of mussel shell, what it looks like. And anybody's been to Florida says, well, it looks like something like a oyster shell, and it is. But a certain portion of this shell can be used for buttons and also for other uses, which we'll get to. And so these little factories punch them out like this into circles to make buttons from. Well, why'd they do that? Well, that was before plastic, and the mother of pearl sheen on that made them great buttons for a long time. But you know, what happened was the detergents yellowed these kind of buttons, and plastic was developed, and the shell supply became depleted. So as time went on, most of the pearl button factories by the late 1950s or mid-1950s were closed. But a new market came up at that time. Since the 1930s, down on the Tennessee River, these shells had been harvested for another reason. The cultured pearl industry, which is basically based in Japan. So a portion of this shell could be used to punch out a circle and a little cube almost, and the cube's inserted in an oyster, and then the oyster, because it irritates the oyster, they secrete this substance which coats that cube and builds it up and makes it an opalescent pearl. Well, the source for all of those little cubes became mostly of the Wabash River, or at least we were a large source of it for quite a while. And the third largest producer, that's not the right word, or compiler, I guess, of these shells was M.D. Cohen and Son at First and Cherry Street. That's, I think, a vacant lot now, as far as I know. Some of you may remember it, M.D. Cohen and Son, and these piles of shells were higher than the fences there for a long time. In the 1970s, these shells were being sold for $400 a ton. And what would happen is the diggers on the river, you catch them in various ways. First of all, some people would catch them simply by using their toes, walking in the river and feeling them and reaching down. But most of it was by a system of rods with wire attached and hooks, and they would move that through the river bottom. And since the oysters or the mussel shells bivalves are open, when they felt something go in there, they clasp it, they pull that up, and that's how they caught them. And then it would take them on shore, of course, and boil them to get rid of the food, to get rid of the what we would think of as food. While mussels are edible, and you can buy various kinds of mussels you can eat, it was not thought that the mussels from the Wabash were healthy to eat, and that's probably true because they did a very good job of removing various kind of pollutants. And then they would bag them up and sell by the ton to the Japanese pearl industry, and they would pay in the 1970s $400 a ton for that. So when, I work at the Swope Art Museum, and Sheldon Swope came to Terre Haute to fight, to go into the Civil War. And after the Civil War, he came back to Terre Haute and started a jewelry store. And he sold a lot of mussel jewelry, a lot of pearls from the Wabash that had been harvested, because they would, in the 19th century, they were harvested. They made a pearl here, just like an oyster does, and that became quite a popular thing. And we have with us today, one of my props is Mary Baker. And Mary has 2 rings from 1907. Why don't you tell us about those?
My 2 rings I have, Fred asked me if I'd walk around, are the pearls I had. My mother's oldest brother played in the 3I League here in Terre Haute in baseball in 1907 and 1908. And one of the gifts he brought to my mother's family, mother's sisters, my mother wasn't born until 1908, late 1908, was to his two younger sisters, 2 pearl rings, and he said the pearls came from the Wabash River. So that is the family history on the rings. And unfortunately, Uncle Pat slid into third base somewhere, did his ankle in, and there ended his baseball career. And I understand at age 23, he was quite a good player, from what I hear. So I will walk around if you like, but it's just, like I told Fred, the rings aren't really valued or anything, but they're sentimental just because of where they came from, and they're to go to my 2 daughters who were born in Terre Haute. So I guess I should give them to them sometime because they're old enough. Thank you, Fred.
Well, pearl jewelry was very popular, and there a lot of it. I suppose a lot of families have passed it down, like Mary Ann's, but I would imagine there's also the problem of, as generations go on, well, where did this come from? What is this? And it may be valuable, seen as pearl necklaces or rings, but not necessarily identified as coming from mussels here on the Wabash River. Who knows? The Vigo County Historical Society has some on display, so if you want to know more about that, it's a good place to go on it. I have here with me today a person who is very knowledgeable about the mussel industry, very knowledgeable about the Wabash River, very knowledgeable about the outdoors, and especially about some of what we're talking about today. So I'd like Marcia Skitz-Everhard to come up and talk about some of what she has brought and to amplify what I have said on some of this. Marcia? Hold on. Put this on you so you get recorded for posterity.
Thank you. Well, I was excited this exhibit came because I'm a Wabash River enthusiast. I kayak it probably once a week during the season, and I grew up about a little bit further than you, about 3 miles away from the Wabash, out near St. Mary's of the Woods Village. And our family purchased that farm in 1843, and I'm the last descendant on it. And so we knew a lot of the people along the river that actually were musselers. And I had some pearls also that had been sent down through the family. They'd never been put into jewelry. They had a lot of different colors and a lot of different shapes. Unfortunately, I loaned them to the Duluth Aquarium up in Minnesota, and they got lost. So I'm very sad about that. But I do have some things. When my family would pass something along, and I think it's when you stay in one spot, you don't have to cull things. So I call myself this, I hope this is appropriate, the keeper of the crap, because I've never moved from the farm. And so, but when they would hand something over, it was like they were handing you the Pope's cross. It was a bequeathing. So one of the things was my great uncle, Dr. Francis Reagan. This had been his mother's, and I guess these were made for their wedding night, and then they put them away. But they said that the mussel shells, the buttons on them, were locally sourced. And as close as I could tell, what they said was there was a place up near Tecumseh where they did them themselves. Now, this was not a major factory, but it was some place where they made the mussels up there. And then this I found, and they said it came from West Terre Haute. And I love the way that this is advertised. I'm going to pass this around. It said it came from Chambon's Variety Store that was right over here. The building still remains. It's right over here on National Avenue. Paris Avenue. So I'm going to pass that around. And the button industry also followed very closely a lot of the things that happened during the time period, the pearl and the mussel industry. With the pearl industry in Indiana, I love this story, so I'm going to give you a story, and this is factual. Back around 1905, there was a gentleman on the Illinois side of the river who did not collect mussels. Did not look for pearls. There was a pearl fever that started in 1905 in Indiana, and everyone came here almost like the gold rush, thinking that they were going to strike it rich. And he was friends with the gentleman who was a pearler. This gentleman went ahead and was just a mussler, and his name was Jumbo Allen, okay? And then the other person's name was Frank Pate, and he was the one who really had the pearl fever. When they would boil these off of the crow's feet, like they said, the dragging devices, if they were using that, they would actually boil them to make the mussels release. They would go ahead and check to see if there was a pearl in them, but they didn't do that necessarily just for the pearls. They were doing that, as kind of a side effect. So this Jumbo, who wasn't looking for pearls, actually found a marble-sized pearl. And there are different ways that you can... Yeah, thank you. There are ways that you can size pearls, and there are also ways that, and this is still current information, that sometimes the pearl is actually valued on the color that it kind of luminesces. And one of the reasons why the Wabash River pearls were so great is Fred talked about this. The amount of, does anyone have a drip coffee maker here in Terre Haute? Drip coffee maker. If you're on well water, especially like me where I live, it lasts about a year, and then if you pull it apart, it's nothing but lime. You got a stepping stone out of it. So we have a really high lime content in the Wabash and in our water systems. Because of that, we have good mussel shells. And when they take that to send over to Japan or China for the culture pearl industry, the nacre, that one layer that they put on there for the culture pearl industry, our mussels are so high in lime, it only takes one layer. And the other thing is that another good thing about, or another way that they look to see if a pearl is a good thing, is whether or not the jeweler can drill a hole through it, because a lot of those were made into necklaces. And if it's not very strong, it will break while they're trying to drill the hole. So we had really, really quality pearls here. So anyway, Jumbo found this marble-sized pearl. This was huge. So it was purchased by a gentleman in Vincennes, Dr. Pepper, that's an easy enough name to remember, and he, for $800. Now, if you think about some of the people that were living in houseboats, house shanties, on the Wabash doing this sort of industry, they did not have a lot of money, and back in 1905, that was a huge amount of money. So he started bragging. It developed a big ruckus between the people who actually, his best friend, Frank Pate, who actually was looking for pearls and never found that magic pearl. So there was resentment there. Well, he sold it to Dr. Pepper, and I'll give you the follow-up on this. Dr. Pepper then sold it to a New York jeweler for $1,200. That's a pretty good markup. That jeweler then sold it to Tiffany's, who then sold it for, I think it went up to $2,000 then. Then it was sold to Paris for $3,000, and then it went into Queen Anne's, Queen Mary's, right, because it was the grandmother of the current, for her wedding in June 22nd, 1911, for the major pearl that was on her necklace. So it came from, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, the paper, that was in the paper this weekend.
Oh, was it? I'm sorry, okay, I didn't see that.
Center pearl on her.
Oh, the video, the things that I've seen. On her tiara?
Tiara.
So if that's already been put out there, I don't need to tell that story, sorry.
Well, no.
Okay, I don't get the paper. I didn't look at the paper.
You're providing a lot more detail.
Okay.
But
So, and they have not been able to find it because the woman who researched this, a few years ago when I was digging into it, was down in Vincennes and researched it, and she actually called to see, or contacted the people who take care of the Queen's jewelry, and they could not literally find it, and they thought that maybe it had gone passed on to family members or somehow it's disappeared. But the folklore on it is that, so anyway, we'll go back to Jumbo. So Jumbo's bragging got him into problems with Frank Pate's family. Frank Pate's nephew in a fight. Of course, there was a lot of alcohol consumption back then, and maybe not the best alcohol. But anyway, he went to shoot Jumbo. Jumbo shot him. So Jumbo ended up having a prison sentence. So he was in prison. His family got all destitute. This fame just kind of ruined them. So then the Queen ends up with this, and it lost its luster. And so they start researching, where did this pearl come from, and why did it lose its luster? Well, then they decided that it lost its luster because it was a blood pearl, because this man, was in jail for this murder. So via different sorts of, connections, the U.S. Embassy somehow got enough money to come and represent Jumbo and get him out of prison. And the luster returned to the pearl. So we've got murder, we've got intrigue, we got royalty, we've got the government involved. So Wabash River really followed a lot of that. The other thing that the industry also kind of followed in history was, and where's our person that's from Iowa? Yeah. So Muscatine was a lot of our pearls, although we had pocket industries along here. Shoals, Indiana on the White River was a big one. But most of ours then eventually got shipped to Muscatine, where there was a huge button industry, button manufacturing company. They were making over 5 million buttons a year. So the gentleman who started that was a German immigrant. And things would happen. They were using a lot of child labor. So like one little girl got her hair caught in one of the laths that turned, and it ripped off half of her skull. And the children were working like 60-hour work weeks. Plus the other people that were working there, adults, would have their eyes put out. It was rough labor. So unions came in and tried to get it unionized. Then there were fights with the police, and they murdered police. They burnt things down. There was arson. So it kind of mimicked the same things that were going on other places in the industrialized nation. Where there was abuse of the workers and the other people were making a lot of money. Out of that came the fact that the gentleman who had started that mill, about 12 years later, was out and got cut with a mussel shell on his foot and died of the infection. So kind of interesting how the mussels took that back. I've been working on a project. It's kind of put on hold because they're looking at a grant. But as a youth, on the Wabash, similar to Fred. And I did get to interview Mr. Cohen before that industry went out. And that year in Indiana, that was in 1991, the mussel industry in the nation was $50 million was what they thought the annual bring from the mussels were. At that point, he was about the only compiler? And it was $3 million just in Indiana, and that was the year that the moratorium went in, and they stopped it. But there was a lot that went on with that. Even states that stopped allowing people to harvest shells, like up in Michigan, they had stopped that. People were they were thieving them. So there was a whole underground market. And what would happen is you might not be able to get them out of the areas in Michigan where they were trying to protect them, but as long as you had a certification of sale, you could sell them in the states that they were legal in. So in 1997, there was only one federal agent that was charged through the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service on watching for all this poaching that was going on. And these people got really good with it. I can remember talking with some of the people in Indiana during that time period that were trying to assist. They would put air compressors up under the styrofoam in their boats so that you could not hear them at night, and they would go underneath and they would scuba dive to get them in the dark. And so these guys were just overridden with trying to get them, and they were taking out, and then they would take the sacks and sink them, and they would leave them under the water, and then they would go back and try and get them all in one fell swoop, because they did not want to get caught crossing state lines with that actual, the evidence. But what would happen is once they got across, someone would write them a certificate that said, yeah, these came from the state where it was legal. So we lost a lot in that manner. Yeah, we took out a lot of them that way. Trying to think. I have some resources up here. I have a poster of a lot of, oh, that's what I was going to say. So I grew up on the Wabash, love the mussel shells. I think one of the first things that really got me interested in them is the St. Anne's Shell Chapel at St. Mary's of the Woods. I just would go in there, daily almost, and look at those shells. And a few years ago, it was built in 1876. So, it's never had any heating, air conditioning, humidity control. That is amazing that building has stayed in the manner that it has. But the shells had fallen off through the years, and the Sisters of Providence had used non-native shells to put back up in there. And so I was kayaking with Sister Barbara Batista on the Wabash one day, and we pulled up to it wasn't a midden. A midden is where either animals or the Native Americans have collected and left caches of these shells. But it was an area where Otter Creek had gotten so strong that it had culled out a part of the bank, and there was a huge area of mussel shells. So I kayak up on it, and I said, one of my dreams my whole life is to take the St. Anne's Shell Chapel and put it all back to native Wabash River mussels. Watch what you say. Because she said, do it. So all of these things are federally protected. You cannot possess, you cannot have them without a federal permit. And so I went through getting a permit through our Indiana DNR for collection and for possession. I took several Sisters of Providence with me on various trips, and we collected Wabash River mussels. Now, the ones that are left around here now, the dead ones that I find, are the larger ones. And I did take Brent Fisher, who's going to be speaking later in this series, go see him, and also the woman from the Nature Conservancy. I went and saw her up in LaPorte, where this exhibit was earlier. She's great. They'll give you a lot of good stuff on the actual biology of them in the rivers and the reintroduction programs. But he went with us, and one of the larger ones that we found, he said, those have been under soil or under sediment for over 200 years. He said, these are your money shells and they're older. Another reason that the Terre Haute, as far as the Wabash goes, is great for our mussels is if you think about where the Wabash starts in Fort Recovery, well, one, it's just a grassy field. I love standing there and going, this is the beginning of the Wabash. But as a river goes, more nutrients are the further down it gets. And when you get to this area, we have a lot of nutrients, which makes for larger mussel shells. So if you're further north, on the upper part of the Wabash, the mussel shells aren't as large, they're not as thick, they're not the money shells. So that's why this area from here to Vincennes is really the money area. So collected a lot of those. If you go out to the St. Anne's Shell Chapel, and it was all a learning process, in the main part of the altar, there is one shell that I put in there where you can see a pearl in it. You gotta kind of look for it. And there is another mussel that I found a perfectly drilled hole in, and since it had probably been under the soil for about 200 years, as per the DNR biologist, I believe Native Americans would use a drill pump and make a hole, and they would use them for fishnet weights. And I believe that probably was used as a fishnet weight, and that's in there also. The other thing I brought in, these are for my family too, another thing bequeathed. Mother of pearl was used for so many things. I couldn't find, I have like some shoe clips that the Victorian women would use on the front of their shoes that were mother of pearl just to kind of dress them up. But like on pocket knives, it's interesting when we take anything from the natural world and try and phase it out, because I also have a program called The Finality of Fashion. That's a whole other thing, all the things we've killed just for fashion. But they try and make it, as they're phasing it out, they try and use products that aren't natural and make them look like it. So one of these knives is not mother of pearl until we finally just decide it's okay. We talked a lot about buttons going away because of, well, plastics, but also zippers. Zippers were a big thing that made a lot of buttons obsolete. If you think about how the backs, used to be all buttons places. Velcro is also kind of taken that away. One of the things I remember as a kid is when we would be washing clothes down at the Reagan farm, of course it was a wringer washer. They loved the mother of pearl buttons. They would cut them off and put them back onto shirts. Like, they were frugal. It's that whole Depression era farm stuff. But they liked them because you'd always get yelled at when you're putting them in. If you had the plastic buttons and they were just a little a kilter, the wringer would snap them. Just snap the button, and you'd ruin all the buttons. But with these, they would actually kind of go into the rubber and not get snapped. So they liked them because they had a longer resiliency as far as that went. They did yellow. So one of the things I would like to share, if you are a river enthusiast, something came out about 3 weeks ago, fresh, hot off the presses. A gentleman has gone and researched Jerry Hay, a long time ago, had put together a Wabash River guide, but I tried to use it a couple of years ago when I did a 70-mile trip. It's very inaccurate. The river changes. A lot of things go away, a lot of things happen. But this is fresh off the press. It's only for the upper Wabash, but this gentleman pulled out all the stops. He found places to stop, things to see, has a lot of history in it. So afterwards, if you're interested in that, you can come up and get the address to order. It's just an individual. So it's not through like Indiana Sciences Academy or anything like that, which there is a great, we're kind of similar to the Ohio Basin. So if you want a really good mussel guide, the Mussels of Ohio is available through the Indiana Academy of Sciences. It's a wonderful book on identifying them. I also have a poster up here that'll show a lot of them, like you said, these wonderful names. I believe the one you show was a warty pimpleback. I like that name too. And then, if anyone wants to stay around, this is just a little program I'm trying to put together for kids. I want them to learn how the Glockita, which are how much has to go together for these to even breed. Have to have the right environment, like you talked about. We've lost a lot of that due to siltation. You have to have a lot of them have species-specific fish that they actually have to get that into. They have to be going over at the right time to get that Glockita into their gills. It's just amazing the intricacies of that. And the woman who's going to be speaking from the Nature Conservancy does a really good job with a PowerPoint program breaking that down. But I'm trying to figure a way to teach this to kids. And I thought, if you're going to teach something, either have food or to have something take home. So for this one, I found in Japan, the Japanese and Chinese will sell these already inoculated, basically, where they put this in. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a piece of grit. It can also be bacteria that forms a pearl. So I think that's kind of cool. Oh, look, there's bacteria in someone's necklace. That's just the condensation nuclei, basically. And so they're selling these little kits where you actually crack open the shell and there's going to be a pearl in there, and it'll be all sorts of different colors. So if anyone would like to see one cracked open afterwards, I'm going to try and crack one of these open and show you what the pearl actually looks like inside of one. So I guess that's great. Oh yeah. Okay, that is tight.
I'm glad you're having the trouble I was. Thanks. Marcia is one of the treasures of the Wabash Valley when it comes to our nature here. We hope to see more of you in the future and these kind of programs, Marcia. It's you bring a flair to it that we really appreciate.
Can I say something about that?
Sure.
Mrs. Nation taught me 6th, 7th, and 8th grade.
That's right. Speaking of that, St. Mary's has been mentioned. I want to make two little points here. First of all, Susan Dolly's with us in the back. She's very humble and shy. Wave your hand, Susan, so people know who you are. And when you go see the exhibit at the Vigo County School Corporation, a lot of people worked on it, but without Susan, this would not have happened. And it's just amazing. And thank you. And a little more about the St. Anne's Chapel, just a little more interesting information for that. That came about because Mother Theodore Guerin, who came to Terre Haute with her 5 companions in 1840, spent the overnight in Terre Haute, went to St. Joseph's Church in the morning, and then got out by stagecoach and other means to St. Mary's, but there was nothing out there. It was just a forest. She didn't know that when she came, but that's what it was. It's a remarkable story of what they have accomplished out there. How she got there exactly is not quite clear. That is what the route was. But it was obviously across the Wabash River. A few years later, in 1845, she 42? She went, thank you, Carl Bender. She returned to France to raise...
43, the fires were 42.
Okay. She returned to France to raise money because they need more money to build buildings, to build the school over there. And coming back, they ran into a tremendous storm. And this was a sailing ship, I believe. I don't think it was, we didn't have steamships yet. And she prayed to God that if she made it safely, she would build a shrine to St. Anne, the mother of Mary. And they did. They built it was a log cabin type of a shrine, which eventually deteriorated, and in 1876, the current St. Anne's Chapel was built. Yes, the mussel shells came from the Wabash. Well, how'd they get them? Novices walked 4 miles to Durkee's Ferry on the river and gathered the shells there, and 4 miles back to do that. And one of the really neat things about this, even though there are some replacement shells in there, it's a pretty good historical example, archaeological example of what the mussels were, or many of them, in the Wabash at that time. So it's a very neat place. They have a little campaign going on to restore the chapel now, so if any of you would like to donate some money to that, I'm sure they'd be very happy to receive it. So in 1967, because of the over-harvesting, the Indiana Department of Natural Resources put into place a number of restrictions. You could still harvest, but you couldn't go scuba diving, you couldn't do certain things like that. You had to use certain techniques. And while that helped, as Skitz has explained, things just got, the market was such and the demand was such, they just became over-harvested. So after a study of the river completed in 1991, the DNR stopped harvesting. So there is no legal harvesting on the river now, and I think they've done a better job of the poachers. I'm sure still exist, but not like it did a few years ago. Overall, there are about 75, 76 species of the river are in this basin, some of them 9 in tributaries, and in 2006, only 30 were known to be reproducing naturally. And this river has been well studied along this line. The first study of mussel shells in the Wabash was 1881. The IDNR is actively working to restock the river, as other states are doing. And on YouTube, you'll find a very interesting video from the University of Kentucky about a center they have to raise mussels for restocking the rivers in the Midwest. Well, why should we care? Well, we should care because the river is important to us, because the river is our lifeline, because it's our source of food, recreation. As we move ahead with a vision of Riverscape to revitalize the riverfront, to make this a more attractive area and quality of life, the river plays a very, very important role. And so much has been accomplished in the last 10 years by Riverscape and people volunteering. And it was pointed out by Kira Amstutz, who is the head of the Indiana Humanities, when she was here Saturday for the opening of the Waterways exhibit at the Vigo County School Corporation, that Terre Haute is the only site where this is an all-volunteer operation. Every place else, the other cities were all, a university or a library or some group that had paid people. What all has been put together here through Riverscape and the library supporting it, and the university supporting it, all this has been all volunteer. But I do want to give a great shout out to Jane Santucci, who is not here today, but Jane has been our Riverscape person par excellence that has really followed up and facilitated so much of this happening. I'd like to close with one small anecdote about the river and how we take things for granted. Jack Hill is the chief operating officer at Union Hospital. He moved here and his family from Mississippi, and they've been in a couple of other locations. They were big in crew, the 4 to 8 paddle rollers. What do you call them?
Oars.
Yeah, oars. Yeah, but shells on the that we see now. Well, anyway, he was here for 6 months. As he tells the story, he was here for 6 months, and he went down to pick up his car at Honda there at First and Wabash when they were still there, or First in Ohio. And he had a little extra time. He says, you know, I know there's a river here. I've never seen it. 6 months here, hadn't seen the river. So he drove down First Street, went down to the Fairbanks Park there, and he looked out and he said, oh my God, he's never seen such a more perfect place for crew than that stretch of river there. And from that, Terre Haute Crew has developed, and we have a very vibrant high school program of men and women on the river, and several of them have received college scholarships to universities and colleges around the Midwest. There are competitive crew programs. I think those are pretty much non-scholarship, more club operations. Purdue University has a huge one, huge program, who helped Jack establish this one here. And it's we're looking forward to having a major meet here of crew from around the Midwest, which will be down at Fairbanks Park and will attract thousands of people. And this all takes communicates about the quality of life we have in the Wabash Valley, which we take for granted, and how the outdoor life is so much an important aspect of it. So, anybody got any questions for Marcia or me that we could answer here? We're good. Well, thank you all for coming. Come up afterwards, look at this. We'll be here for a few minutes. Appreciate you coming.